not bound to yield obedience. That was no mere slogan. It was a call to action printed across the colonies in 1765. The British had just passed the Stamp Act. But in Virginia, a 29-year-old freshman legislator named Patrick Henry pushed back hard. "If this be treason," is what he thundered in support of his Virginia resolves. They didn't just protest the tax, they rejected Parliament's power outright and called for resistance. And when they tried to silence his message, he stood firm, and the other colonies joined in, publishing every single word. On this episode, defiance, suppression, and the spark that lit the fuse. But first of all, welcome, and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, May 30th, 2025. To kick this off, we have to start the story in March of 1765. That's when Parliament passed the hated Stamp Act, a raw assertion of power over the colonies. Now, of course, people were aware that this was kind of on the way, so there had been some resolutions about this already. And it took news a few weeks to actually hit the colonies. And as Joe Wolverton writes in his article, he said news of the act's passage reached Virginia in April of 1765, but the sparks really didn't begin flying until May, when a young, newly elected member from the county of Louisa took the ancient oath of office and set out to use all his talents to fight this latest example of British tyranny. That brash young firebrand was, of course, Patrick Henry. It was May 20th that Patrick Henry actually took his seat in the House for the first time. He was just 28 years old. And then on May 29th, 1765, Joe writes, this was the day of his 29th birthday, Patrick Henry offered a series of resolutions for consideration by the House of Burgesses. Sometime before offering those resolutions, Joe writes, Patrick Henry shared them with both George Johnston and John Fleming, both of whom pledged their support to Henry and to the passage of his resolutions. Henry had a series of 7 resolutions ready to roll, and each of them had a principle that built upon the other and ramped things up. First of all, Virginians are entitled to all the rights of Englishmen. He said the first adventurers and settlers of this colony brought with them and transmitted to their posterity all the liberties, privileges, franchises, and immunities that have at any time been held, enjoyed, and possessed by the people of Great Britain. So it became part of their birthright. But next, he also pointed out that this was confirmed in their charter. He said that by 2 royal charters granted by King James I, the colonists aforesaid are declared entitled to all the liberties, privileges, and immunities of denizens and natural subjects, as if they had been abiding and born within the realm of England. And the third, we're all kind of familiar with the principle, of course. It's basically no taxation without representation, because as Patrick Henry pointed out, without that kind of basis, there's absolutely no way the taxation would stop. It would always be burdensome and oppressive. He said that the taxation of the people by themselves, I mean, I'm not sure if I would ever go for that, but it's a different story. Taxation by the people by themselves or by persons chosen by themselves to represent them, who can only know what taxes the people are able to bear or the easiest mode of raising them, and must themselves be affected by every tax laid on the people, is the only security against a burdensome taxation, and the distinguishing characteristic of British freedom, without which the ancient Constitution cannot exist. Now, of course, he's talking about the unwritten British Constitution, but he's saying this is our system. And if you don't have the representation, well, this is going to lead to all kinds of problems. And the 4th resolution basically reiterates this and points out that these taxes would only be made with their consent. And this is how things have been all along. So there's also some history and tradition in this as well. He said, the people of this most ancient and loyal colony have without interruption enjoyed the inestimable right of being governed by such laws respecting their internal polity and taxation as are derived from their own consent. And the same hath never been forfeited or yielded up, but hath been constantly recognized by the kings and people of Great Britain. Now, the fifth is where they think he went a little crazy. He went off the deep end because Patrick Henry dared to say that an act of Parliament was illegal, unconstitutional, and shouldn't exist and destroys liberty. Here's how he put it. The General Assembly of this colony, together with His Majesty or his substitutes, have in their representative capacity the only exclusive right and power to lay taxes and imposts upon the inhabitants of this colony. But wait, there's more. He said, and that every attempt to vest such power in any other person or persons whatever than the General Assembly aforesaid is illegal, unconstitutional, and unjust, and have a manifest tendency to destroy British as well as American liberty. And as my friend Joe Wolverton points out, he said it was during this debate on the fifth and the most contentious of the first five resolutions that Patrick Henry spoke words that have been passed into the lore of the early days of American discontent with English rule. Patrick Henry's biographer, William Wirt, described his stirring remarks as well as the reaction of the politicians who were so offended. He wrote, it was in the midst of this magnificent debate, while he was descanting on the tyranny of the obnoxious act, that he exclaimed in a voice of thunder and with the look of a god, Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III. Of course, he was interrupted immediately. Treason, cried the speaker. Treason, treason, echoed from every part of the house. It was one of those trying moments which is decisive of character. And a young Patrick Henry did not back down. He said, Henry faltered not for an instant, but rising to a loftier attitude and fixing on the speaker an eye of the most determined fire, he finished his sentence with the firmest emphasis. May profit by their example. If this be treason, make the most of it. Now, there's actually no surviving transcript of Henry's speech, and Wirt reconstructed it many, many years later based on, well, really a legend and through interviews with people who were there. So we don't know if this is real or if it's not, but what we do know is that something pretty significant went down, and a young Thomas Jefferson, who was just 22 years old, was there, and he described it as torrents of sublime eloquence from Mr. Henry. And as Jefferson pointed out, he said Mr. Henry moved and Johnston seconded these resolutions successfully. So they had these five introduced. We have this if this be treason debate. And then they were opposed by Randolph, Bland, Pendleton, Nicholas, Wythe, and all the old members whose influence in the House had till then been unbroken. Now, Jefferson went on to explain that they weren't necessarily opposing the principle. They didn't like the tone. They thought it was too aggressive, not a good idea. Now, the first four of them passed. I think it was pretty easily. I don't know the vote total on those, but it was the fifth that was so contentious. It was really close. And that's how Jefferson described it as well. He said the last, however, and strongest resolution was carried, but by a single vote. The debate on it was most bloody. I was then but a student, and was listening at the door of the lobby, for as yet there was no gallery, when Peyton Randolph, after the vote, came out of the house and said as he entered the lobby, by God, I would have given 500 guineas for a single vote. For as this would have divided the House, the vote of Robinson, the Speaker, would have rejected the resolution. They just needed one more vote to come as a tie and then kill that resolution. And this is where Patrick Henry made at 29 years old and, well, at this point, probably 2 days, he made what could be called a rookie mistake, but maybe not because of how things played out. After passage of those 5, Henry just left for home, convinced that he got the job done. Everything's cool here. But as his Red Hill National Memorial points out, the next day, under pressure from the governor and the council, the House rescinded Henry's 5th resolution and then had it erased from the official journal. This didn't even happen according to the journal. And Virginia's royal governor, Francis Fauquier, I believe is how you say it, Francis Fauquier, even prevented the publication of the 4 that passed in the Virginia Gazette, at least temporarily. So they went out of their way to say, this cannot get out to anyone. They probably knew it would lead to some problems for them, but somehow it still spread around like wildfire. Rhode Island, for example, included a version of it in their own resolutions against the Stamp Act, which were passed in September of 1765. Here's resolution number 4, that therefore the General Assembly of this colony have in their representative capacity the only exclusive right to lay taxes and imposts upon the inhabitants of this colony, and that every attempt to vest such power in any person or persons, whatever, other than the General Assembly aforesaid, is unconstitutional, same message as Patrick Henry, and hath a manifest tendency to destroy the liberties of the people of this colony. Now, William Wirt asked about this many years later. This is in 1815, discussing it back and forth with Thomas Jefferson and some others. Hey, how did this get out there? No one even knew for sure at that point, because they all knew that the governor and the governor's council, first of all, they worked with the House to actually rescind that 5th resolve because that one was seriously bad to them. And it wasn't even the most aggressive one. We got 2 more coming up that are way more intense than those. And they went out of their way to try to make sure that they wouldn't get published. But still, of course, the spirit of liberty pushes on. And here's how Wirt put it. These were obviously copied with a few slight variations from the resolution of Virginia, talking about the Rhode Island resolutions, and retain the 5th, which was expunged here. But how did this 5th resolution get to Rhode Island, having been expunged from our journals? Probably by a letter from George Johnston or some other patriot in our House. So they don't even know at this point who spread it out. So they tried to block publication, and they just couldn't get it done. Now, I realize I'm blasting through a lot of original source information pretty quickly here, but it's my hope that this serves as sort of a highlight reel for you. And if you're the kind of person who wants to learn more, this is interesting enough for you that you want to do some research on it, rather than just the highlights, well, you're in luck because the TAC has it covered with at least a little bit of help. After every single episode, we publish a blog post over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. My buddy Alan Mosley does an awesome, very consistent, very timely job of getting the blog post organized. And in it, you'll find a show links section with the stuff that I'm mentioning in the episode, generally in the order that I go through it in the show, as long as I've done a good job with my notes for Alan, but I do my best. So you're going to find things like, well, of course, Patrick Henry's resolves. You're going to find Thomas Jefferson's writings, William Wirt's book, Joe Wolverton's article. I've got an article in there as well, but all that stuff, again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. I'll get it published a couple of hours after the live stream is done. Now let's get back to it. We were talking about how they were working to basically shut up the resistance, shut up Patrick Henry. They didn't want his message getting out there. They probably saw it as dangerous because that's what they do when they have opposition. They work to block publication, but it still made it to Rhode Island. Anyways, even the stuff that they didn't get published. But that's not even the most radical of the resolutions, not even close. Here's number 6. Patrick Henry's continuing to ramp it up. I don't believe this ever passed or even got a vote, but here's how he put it. Resolved that His Majesty's liege people, the inhabitants of this colony, are not bound to yield obedience to any law or ordinance whatever, designed to impose any taxation whatsoever upon them, other than the laws or ordinances of the General Assembly aforesaid. Now, that kind of message sounds familiar to you, especially if you've been around the 10th Amendment Center for any amount of time. Well, it should, because, I mean, if you think about it, that 6th resolution was really a precursor to the 10th Amendment, a line in the sand of what the far-off government was authorized to do and how everything else that dealt with internal policy and taxation was left to the people of the colony, how we have the people of the several states. And that's how I described it briefly in an article on this last year. Henry argued that while Parliament might handle general matters affecting all, anything related to internal policy and taxation could only come from the people's local representatives. Sounds like the roots of the 10th Amendment, doesn't it? He was like the original 10th Amendment guy so many years before there was an Articles of Confederation, before there was independence, before there was a constitution, all of it. It was that principle of delegated and reserved powers. And then on top of it, calling for non-compliance with unconstitutional acts, unconstitutional and illegal acts, well, that's a precursor to nullification as well. But this last resolution really hits like a hammer, and Henry did not hold back at all. Resolved that any person who shall, by speaking or writing, assert or maintain that any person or persons other than the General Assembly of this colony, with such consent as aforesaid, have any right or authority to lay or impose any tax whatever on the inhabitants thereof, shall be deemed an enemy to this his majesty's colony. Now again, this spread around fast. And as Redhill pointed out, despite the attempt to suppress news of the legislature's denunciation of the Stamp Act, within a few weeks, versions of all 7 of Henry's resolutions were published in other colonies. Even though only 4 finally made it past, all 7 were published as printed in Maryland, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and other colonies. Henry's resolves articulated the principles of American rejection of parliamentary authority. And not every publication printed all of them, and not all of them printed them really word for word. This is kind of like, there were some rumors spreading of what happened, and none of them wrote about them as, well, only these passed, but these were also included. Some of them published 4, some of them 5, some 6. I'm not sure if any of them published all 7. Ultimately, it didn't matter that only 4 of these were officially adopted. It didn't matter that 1 was rescinded. And it didn't matter that 2 of them probably never even got a vote. Because once they hit the presses, they spread like wildfire. Patrick Henry's resistance became Virginia's resistance. Virginia's resistance became America's resistance. And back to my article from last year, Governor Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts, in his words, he noted, "Nothing extravagant appeared in the papers till an account was received of the Virginia resolves. Edmund Burke saw them as the spark for the resistance to the Stamp Act that led toward American independence." And years later, Patrick Henry himself looked back on that moment and wrote this on the back of his own copy of the resolutions. He said, "The alarm spread throughout America with astonishing quickness, and the ministerial party were overwhelmed. The great point of resistance to British taxation was universally established in the colonies." So he recognized how this spread quickly and built the resistance and the stand against British taxation. He said this brought on the war, which finally separated the 2 countries and gave independence to ours. But is that going to be an awesome thing or not? He doesn't know yet. It's still not a final story for Patrick Henry at this point. Whether this will prove a blessing or a curse, he wrote, will depend upon the use our people make of the blessings which a gracious God hath bestowed on us. And then Patrick Henry closed out with what I think is a message for the ages. He said, if they are wise, they will be great and happy. If they are of a contrary character, they will be miserable. Righteousness alone can exalt them as a nation. Reader, whoever thou art, remember this, and in thy sphere practice virtue thyself, and encourage it in others. Not bound to yield obedience to unconstitutional acts. Patrick Henry's slogan for the revolution is not something we learn much about in the government-run and government-approved schools today. And that's a big part of the reason why we work so hard every single day here at the 10th Amendment Center to reach and teach more and more people about this essential and long-forgotten history from the American Revolution, from the founders, from the revolutionaries, and from the people they read and learn from. And nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat that's quickly devaluing day in and day out, year in and year out, please consider throwing it our way. Almost no one punches above their weight class better than the TAC. I think no one does, actually. Our membership program starts out at just $2 a month. It's over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options for you to consider. I'm very grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us as a member today. But if you don't want to be a member and still want to help us out financially, that's super cool. No sweat at all, no pressure. And of course, if you already are a member and want to help us out more, that's even more awesome. I'm very grateful for that. I want to make sure you have where you can do that. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. And as I mentioned in every episode, there's a bunch of free and easy peasy things you can do to help us spread the word, whether you want to help us out financially, otherwise, or both. I'm very grateful. Of course, things like leaving reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform. Watch time percentage on YouTube is a huge one. So if it's a 10-minute video and you watch 15 minutes, that's 150%. 30 minutes is 300%. So you get the idea there. But of course, hitting the like button, subscribing, getting notifications, comments are pretty big. Engage in the comments, share links, and the like. Again, I really, really appreciate your help and support in spreading the word. We're reaching way more people than I ever thought possible on this, but we're still just scratching the surface. So thank you so much. And thank you so much for spending some of your time with me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it was entertaining once in a while. I hope it was interesting. But more important than anything, I hope it made you think, and I hope you learned something. Again, I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I'll see you next week, Wednesday, on the path to liberty.